The patrol car stopped in front of the house at 17 minutes past 9 in the morning. Victoria Hayes stood on the sidewalk with the kind of expression that belonged to someone who believed she had already won. She wore a blazer, the color of dried blood, and held a clipboard against her chest like a shield. Behind her, two neighbors lingered at a careful distance, close enough to watch, far enough to pretend they hadn't been summoned. Ethan Walker stood at the edge of his own yard, a hammer still loose in one hand, sawdust on his forearms, and nothing on his face but calm. "You were warned," Victoria said. "This land belongs to the association." Ethan didn't argue. He set the hammer down on the porch step, turned, and walked into the house. When he came back out, he was carrying a cardboard file box, its corners soft with age, its lid held down by a single rubber band that looked older than the house itself. The officer opened the first folder and began to read. He read it once. Then he read it again, slower the second time, his eyes tracking back to a line near the top of the page as if he needed to confirm he hadn't misunderstood it. Victoria's composure started to slip. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, and her voice had lost the edge it carried 30 seconds earlier. The officer looked up. "Ma'am," he said, "do you understand exactly what you just asked us to come out here for?" Victoria said nothing. And that silence, more than anything Ethan could have said himself, was the moment she realized she had made the worst mistake of her tenure as president of the Cedar Hollow Homeowners Association. Nobody on Larkspur Lane could have predicted how the morning would end. Cedar Hollow was the kind of community built on the promise of order, manicured lawns, matching mailboxes, a set of governing documents thick enough to double as a doorstop. Victoria Hayes had been elected president 3 years earlier on a platform of enforcing those documents to the letter, promising residents a return to what she called neighborhood discipline, after what she considered a period of lax oversight under the previous administration. She took the role seriously, perhaps too seriously, treating every violation notice as a small victory for order over chaos. She had built her identity around the belief that the rules existed to be followed precisely because she was the one interpreting them. And in 3 years, almost nobody had ever successfully challenged her on a point of fact. Ethan Walker was about to become the first. That morning had started like any other. Ethan Walker was 42 years old, a structural inspector by trade, a man who had spent 2 decades reading blueprints and property surveys the way other people read newspapers. He noticed load-bearing cracks before contractors did. He caught misplaced beams before inspectors signed off on them. It was a career built on precision, on trusting documents over impressions, and it had shaped the way he approached almost everything in his life, including the small, unremarkable dispute that was about to consume his entire week. He had bought the house on Larkspur Lane 4 years earlier, drawn to the half-acre lot at the back of the property, a stretch of land shaded by 3 old oak trees that the previous owner had always called the quiet corner. On that Tuesday, Ethan was doing nothing more dramatic than replacing a section of wooden fence that had rotted through after years of rain. It was ordinary work, the kind of work homeowners did every weekend across the country without a second thought. Victoria Hayes arrived with 2 board members flanking her like an honor guard, and she did not offer a greeting. She walked straight up the gravel path, stopped 6 feet from where Ethan was working, and told him to put the tools down immediately. "You are not authorized to do that," she said. Ethan straightened up and wiped his hands on his jeans. "Under what provision?" he asked. Victoria held out a laminated notice, the kind that had clearly been printed dozens of times before and handed to dozens of other residents. She stated, without hesitation, that the section of land Ethan was working on belonged to the association's common area, and that any construction on it required prior board approval which had never been requested, let alone granted. Ethan told her evenly that he held a certified deed showing the boundary lines of his property and that the fence sat well within them. Victoria's mouth curled into something between a smile and a sneer. "Your paperwork doesn't outrank the association's governing documents," she said. It was a small sentence, only a dozen words, but it was the sentence that would define everything that followed. Victoria demanded that Ethan remove the section of fence he had just installed. He refused, calmly, the way a man refuses something he has already thought through many times before. Victoria warned him that if he did not comply, she would call the police. Ethan looked at her, unbothered, and told her to go ahead. She did not hesitate. She pulled her phone from her blazer pocket and dialed emergency services right there on the gravel path, her voice rising into the practiced tone of someone reporting a crime rather than offense. Word of the call moved through Cedar Hollow faster than the patrol car itself. By the time the sirens were even audible in the distance, 3 more residents had gathered near the property line, drawn by the kind of curiosity that only a confrontation between neighbors can produce. A retired schoolteacher named Margaret Simmons crossed her arms and watched from her porch. A younger couple, Brian and Lisa Kowalski, paused their morning jog to see what the commotion was about. Victoria used the waiting time to build her case out loud, narrating the situation to anyone within earshot. She said Ethan had ignored repeated warnings. She said he had built onto association land without permission. She said this was exactly the kind of disregard for community standards that the board had been trying to correct for months. Ethan did not raise his voice to counter any of it. He simply asked her one question. "Did you bring the official survey with you?" he asked. Victoria hesitated, just long enough for the pause to be noticed by the small crowd. "I have the association's map," she said. "I asked about the survey," Ethan repeated. She didn't answer that. Instead, she glanced down at a folded photocopy in her hand, something she had brought specifically for this confrontation, and Ethan, watching carefully, recognized in an instant that it wasn't the same survey document he had seen years earlier during his own closing on the house. He said nothing about it yet. He filed the detail away, the same way he filed away every small inconsistency in every blueprint he had ever reviewed professionally, and he waited. The sound of a patrol car turning onto Larkspur Lane broke the tension. Victoria's expression shifted into something almost triumphant, as if the arrival of law enforcement alone would settle the matter in her favor within minutes. She had, in fact, called the police twice before over minor disputes with other residents, disputes over paint colors and mailbox styles, and both times the mere presence of a uniform had been enough to make the other party back down. She had no reason to expect this morning would be any different. Officer Daniel Reed stepped out of the car first, followed by his partner, a younger officer named Marcus Delgado. Reed had the unhurried posture of a man who had responded to 1,000 disputes between neighbors and had long since stopped expecting any of them to be simple. He had learned, over many years on patrol, that the person who called first was not always the person in the right, and that the loudest voice on a residential street rarely told the whole story. Victoria moved toward him before he had even closed the car door, already speaking, already building her narrative before he could ask a single question. "Officer, this man is trespassing on association property," she said. "He's built an illegal structure on common land that belongs to every homeowner in this community." Reed held up a hand, not unkindly, and asked her a direct question. "Do you have documentation proving the association owns this section of land?" Victoria produced the folded map from her blazer pocket and handed it over. Reed studied it for a long moment, then turned toward Ethan. "And you, sir?" "I have documentation as well," Ethan said. Victoria laughed, a short, dismissive sound. "He has paperwork for buying the house. That's not the same as ownership of this particular section." Ethan didn't respond to the jab. He walked back into the house without a word, and for a moment Victoria assumed he was retreating, perhaps looking for an excuse to avoid further scrutiny. But when he returned, he was carrying the same brown file box from earlier, and he set it down carefully on the hood of the patrol car. "This is the complete property record," Ethan said. "Everything from the closing, plus records I pulled from the county afterward." Reed opened the box and began sorting through it methodically. Inside were the original deed, a certified property survey dated to the year of purchase, the recorded plat map from the county assessor's office, a set of easement records going back nearly 3 decades, and a folder of correspondence Ethan had kept from his own due diligence when he bought the property. Reed's expression, initially neutral, began to change as he worked through the documents. He read slower. He flipped back to compare pages. Victoria watched his face shift and felt, for the first time that morning, a small current of unease settle into her chest, though she pushed it down and told herself it meant nothing. Reed finally looked up at her. "You're saying this section belongs to the association," he said. It wasn't a question anymore. It was a statement, delivered with the flat caution of a man who already suspected the answer was more complicated than the woman standing in front of him wanted to admit. "That's correct," Victoria said. "Then we need to talk about this document," Reed said, and he held up the certified survey for her to see. Officer Delgado, standing quietly beside the car, began jotting notes into a small notepad, documenting the presence of 2 conflicting maps, a detail that would later matter far more than anyone standing on that street realized in the moment. Reed spread the papers across the hood of the car, working through them one at a time with the patience of a man who understood that a 5-minute mistake could take months to unwind if handled carelessly. Ethan explained that when he purchased the house, he had hired an independent surveyor to walk the entire boundary before closing, a habit he had carried over from his professional life, where a misplaced line on a blueprint could mean a building collapsed rather than a fence dispute. The surveyor's findings were clear and specific. The disputed strip of land, the one Victoria insisted belonged to the association, fell entirely within the legal boundaries of Ethan's parcel. Victoria still wasn't convinced, or wasn't willing to appear convinced in front of the small crowd that had gathered along the edge of the street. The association has its own map, she said again, as if repetition alone could restore her authority. Reed asked her a simple question in return. When was that map recorded with the county? Victoria opened her mouth and then closed it. She didn't have an answer. It was at that point that someone in the crowd placed a call to Richard Cole, the association's longtime attorney, a man who had represented the board through more disputes than anyone could count, and who arrived within 20 minutes looking like he had left his coffee cup sitting on his desk. He wore a gray suit that seemed slightly too formal for a residential street on a Tuesday morning, and he carried a leather folder that he had clearly grabbed on his way out the door, without knowing exactly what he was walking into. He inserted himself immediately into the conversation, telling everyone gathered that this was a civil matter and that nobody should be examining private documents on a public street. Reed disagreed, evenly. I understand your position, Reed said, but if the association called the police to report a trespassing violation, we have an obligation to determine whether a trespass actually occurred before anyone leaves. Richard asked to see the deed. Ethan handed it over without hesitation. Richard read through the first few lines, his eyes moving quickly, professionally, the way a man reads when he is looking for an exit rather than an answer. Then his expression changed. It was subtle, but Ethan caught it, and so did Reed. The deed's legal description was precise, specific, unambiguous. The section Victoria had called common area sat squarely inside the boundary lines described in Ethan's own recorded deed. Richard turned to Victoria. Victoria, he said, do you have the association's original recorded documentation, not the internal map, the original filing? Of course I do, she said. I need to see it now, Richard said. And there was a new tightness in his voice that hadn't been there 10 minutes earlier. Victoria retrieved the association's community map from her car and brought it back. Reed laid it flat beside the county's recorded plat, the two documents side by side on the hood of the patrol car for everyone to compare. The boundary lines did not match. Not close enough to call it a rounding error, not close enough to explain away as an old scan or a faded copy. The lines diverged clearly, cutting through the disputed section in two entirely different places, as if two entirely different surveyors had walked two entirely different pieces of land decades apart. One of the homeowners standing nearby, Lisa Kowalski, leaned in to look and said, almost to herself, wait, so which map have we actually been using this whole time? Victoria's jaw tightened. Richard tried to smooth things over, explaining that the association's map was simply an internal administrative reference, not intended as a legal survey. Then why has it been used to issue violation notices to residents? Reed asked. Nobody answered him. Margaret Simmons, watching from her porch, folded her arms tighter and said nothing, though her expression suggested she was doing quiet arithmetic in her head, counting up every notice she herself had received over the years and wondering, for the first time, whether any of them had been legitimate. Ethan remained composed through all of it. He reached back into his file box and produced another document, the original independent survey conducted before his purchase, its boundary markers drawn with the precision of a professional who had no reason to favor one side or the other. The lines matched the county's recorded plat exactly. Victoria's composure cracked further. She accused Ethan of deliberately withholding this information from the association, of sitting on documentation that could have prevented all of this. I didn't withhold anything, Ethan said. I simply never imagined I would need to prove ownership of my own land to someone standing on it uninvited. It was Reed who noticed the detail that would change the entire direction of the confrontation. Buried near the bottom of one of the older documents in Ethan's file box was a single line, easy to miss unless a person was looking for exactly that kind of thing. It read, "Recorded easement terminated." Reed tapped the line with one finger. Who granted the association the right to use this section in the first place? He asked. Victoria said nothing. The silence stretched long enough that Richard finally stepped in and answered for her, though his answer only made things worse. He explained that decades earlier, a previous board had negotiated a limited easement with an earlier owner of the property, allowing the association to place landscaping equipment, signage, and maintenance access through that section of land. It had been a narrow, specific agreement, and it had never been intended to last forever. It had a clear expiration clause built into the original filing, a clause that any attorney reviewing the association's records should have caught years earlier. Ethan confirmed what came next. According to the documentation in his file, that easement had expired years before he had even purchased the house. The termination had been formally recorded with the county. Despite that, the association had continued treating the section as common area. They had continued placing equipment there. They had continued sending maintenance crews through it twice a month, trimming hedges and mowing grass that belonged, legally, to someone else entirely. And, more significantly, they had continued charging every resident in the community, a maintenance fee that was calculated in part based on the upkeep of that very strip of land. Victoria's face lost color. "I wasn't aware the easement had expired," she said, though her voice lacked the conviction it had carried an hour earlier. Ethan pulled one more document from the box, a notice he had sent to the association several months prior, informing them in writing that the easement was no longer valid, and requesting that the board update its records accordingly. At the bottom of that notice was a signature, Victoria's signature, dated and confirmed, acknowledging receipt. Richard's hand went to his temple. He told Victoria, quietly but not quietly enough, to stop answering questions until he had a chance to review everything from the beginning. Ethan produced a third document, a certified copy obtained directly from the county recorder's office. This one was the most damaging of all. It didn't just confirm that the association had continued using land it no longer had any legal right to. It showed in plain financial terms that residents across the community had been paying maintenance fees tied to the upkeep of a parcel that was, and had been for years, private property. Reed set the papers down and looked at Victoria for a long moment. "Now I understand why you called us out here," he said. "What do you mean by that?" Victoria asked, though something in her voice suggested she already understood exactly what he meant. "I mean," Reed said, "you tried to turn an ownership dispute into a trespassing complaint, hoping the uniform standing in your driveway would settle the argument before anyone looked too closely at the paperwork." Victoria's transformation, from confident to furious, to something quieter and more frightened, happened in stages that the small crowd watched unfold in real time. First came the accusations. She insisted that Ethan must have forged something, that no ordinary homeowner kept files this thorough unless he had planned this confrontation in advance. Ethan didn't dignify the accusation with a response. Reed, however, did, warning Victoria plainly that making unsupported claims of forgery against a resident in front of witnesses, while an officer was actively reviewing documentation, was not something she wanted to do, and that such an accusation, made without evidence, could itself become a problem for her later. Richard asked to review the entire file, and Ethan handed it over without protest. Richard read through it page by page, his expression growing more strained with every document. Buried near the back was a letter carrying the signature of a previous association president, a woman named Carol Whitfield, who had served nearly a decade earlier. The letter confirmed, in her own handwriting, the actual boundary lines of the property, matching precisely with the county's recorded plat rather than the internal map the association currently relied upon. She had apparently flagged the discrepancy herself, years before Victoria ever took office, and had recommended the board update its records. Nothing had ever come of that recommendation. Victoria couldn't argue with a signature that predated her entire tenure. "That was the previous president," she said. "I'm not responsible for what she did." Ethan replied quietly, "I never said you were responsible for what she did." He paused. "I said you're responsible for what you do after you learn the truth." The line landed hard enough that even Richard didn't try to soften it. Margaret Simmons, still watching from her porch, nodded once, slowly, as though the sentence had settled something she had wondered about for a very long time. Reed asked Victoria for the original documentation the association had relied on when issuing prior violation notices to Ethan and other residents. Victoria didn't have it with her. She said it was back at the association office. Reed made a note of that. Richard looked at her, and for the first time that morning, it was clear he understood the situation had grown far beyond a simple property line dispute. Ethan reached into his file box one final time and pulled out a sealed envelope, the kind a person keeps prepared for exactly the situation unfolding in front of him. "I kept this in case things escalated," he said. Inside was a copy of records pulled directly from the county, records that confirmed, beyond any reasonable dispute, that the section of land the association had spent years managing, maintaining, and charging fees for was in fact private property belonging to Ethan Walker. But there was something else in the envelope, something that mattered even more. Several of the association's maintenance contracts, the ones covering landscaping and upkeep for that section of the community, had been signed under the explicit assumption that the land in question belonged to the association. Contracts, signed agreements, financial commitments made on the basis of ownership the association did not actually hold, running back for years, invoiced and paid for out of dues collected from every household on the street, including Ethan's own. This was no longer a fence dispute. This was a question that touched on land use rights, years of collected maintenance fees, a chain of violation notices sent under false pretenses, unauthorized access to private property, and the responsibility of an entire governing board that had either failed to check its own records or had chosen not to. Officer Delgado, still standing near the patrol car with his notepad, quietly asked Richard whether the association carried liability insurance covering claims related to unauthorized use of private property. Richard admitted that he would need to review the policy, a response that told everyone present he wasn't entirely sure the answer would be favorable. Reed made a note of the question as well, not because it fell within his jurisdiction to answer, but because he understood that whatever happened next would likely involve people whose job it was to sort out exactly that kind of liability. He had seen enough neighborhood disputes escalate into lawsuits to recognize the shape of one forming in real time, and he made it a point to document everything thoroughly, aware that his report might end up being read by an attorney long after he had moved on to his next call. Victoria, for her part, seemed to shrink with every new question raised. The clipboard she had carried so confidently that morning now hung loosely at her side, forgotten. She glanced toward Richard for guidance, but he was too absorbed in the documents to offer any. She glanced toward the small crowd of neighbors, hoping perhaps to find someone still willing to back her version of events. But even the 2 board members who had arrived with her that morning had gone quiet, unwilling to attach their names to a position that was crumbling in front of them. Victoria finally asked the question that mattered most to her in that moment. "What do you want?" she said. Ethan's answer was simple. "I want you to stop telling people I'm trespassing on my own land." Reed closed the file box. "I think we've established who actually holds ownership here," he said. "So he gets to keep the fence?" Victoria asked, though her voice had lost all of its earlier certainty. Reed looked at her evenly. "Based on what I just read," he said, "the question isn't whether he gets to keep the fence." He paused. "The question is whether the association ever had the authority to tell him to take it down in the first place." By the time Victoria fully absorbed what had just happened, she had lost every ounce of leverage she walked in with. The homeowners who had gathered along the street were no longer watching Ethan with suspicion. They were watching Victoria, and their questions had shifted entirely. Brian Kowalski asked, "If that land belongs to him, why have we been paying for its upkeep out of our own dues?" Another neighbor, a man named Gregory Patton, who had lived in Cedar Hollow longer than almost anyone, asked whether this meant other sections of the community might be affected by the same kind of mapping error. Richard tried to wave the questions away, urging everyone not to speculate before the board had time to review the situation properly, but even he no longer sounded like a man defending Victoria's position. He sounded like a man calculating how much liability the association had just exposed itself to, and how many billing cycles of maintenance fees might now need to be reconsidered. Reed made it clear, more than once, that police officers were not in the business of settling civil property disputes. That responsibility belonged to courts, to county records, to attorneys, but he was equally clear that based on the documentation sitting on the hood of his patrol car, there was no reasonable basis for treating Ethan as someone who had committed a criminal trespass on land that wasn't his own. He advised Victoria, in a tone that was professional but unmistakably firm, that any further attempt to compel Ethan to remove structures from his own property, absent a valid court order, could expose the association to further complications. Victoria stared at the fence Ethan had built. Then she looked down at the brown file box resting beside it. Slowly, the reality settled over her. The phone call she had placed with such certainty, the one she was sure would end with Ethan being forced to comply, had instead become the exact mechanism that pulled every hidden document out into the open, in front of witnesses, in front of an officer of the law, in front of the very people she was supposed to represent. Ethan didn't gloat. He didn't raise his voice or demand an apology. "I tried to settle this with paperwork months ago," he said. "You're the one who decided to turn it into a confrontation." Reed prepared to leave, his partner already back behind the wheel of the patrol car. But before climbing in himself, he turned back toward Ethan one more time. "Mr. Walker," he said, "I'd recommend holding on to every one of those documents very carefully." "Why is that?" Ethan asked. "Because I don't think this ends here," Reed said. The days that followed moved slower than the morning itself, though the consequences kept unfolding in ways that surprised even Ethan. News of the confrontation spread through Cedar Hollow the way small neighborhood stories always do, passed from porch to porch, embellished slightly with each retelling, though the core of it remained essentially true. A homeowner had been threatened over a fence, the police had been called, and the paperwork had turned everything upside down. Several residents who had received similar notices from the association over the years began quietly pulling their own deeds and surveys out of storage, comparing them against the boundary lines on the association's outdated map, wondering whether they too had been paying fees for land they either already owned outright or had never actually been obligated to maintain. Richard Cole spent the following week buried in the county recorder's archives, cross-referencing decades of filings against the association's internal records. What he found troubled him more with every passing day. The termination of the original easement had been recorded properly, filed exactly where it should have been, sitting in public records the entire time, waiting for anyone with the diligence to look. Nobody had looked, Board after board, president after president, had simply inherited the outdated internal map and treated it as gospel, never once cross-checking it against the documents that actually governed ownership. It was, as Richard put it in a private memo to the board, a failure of institutional memory rather than a single act of bad faith, though he was careful to note that Victoria's decision to escalate the matter by involving law enforcement had transformed a quiet administrative error into a matter of public record and potential liability. In the weeks that followed, the association was forced to undertake a full review of its property maps, cross-referencing every parcel boundary against the county's official records. They had to identify precisely which sections of the community actually fell under their jurisdiction and which did not. They discontinued all maintenance activity on Ethan's land, effective immediately, given the absence of any valid legal authority to continue. Every violation notice issued in connection with that section over the preceding years had to be reconsidered, and in several cases, formally withdrawn. Internal records that had gone unchecked for years suddenly required correction, verification, and in some cases, complete reconstruction. The board hired an outside surveying firm to walk every disputed boundary in the community, a process that would take months and cost the association more in professional fees than it had spent on landscaping in the previous 3 years combined. Victoria faced a board meeting unlike any she had presided over before. The community room, usually half empty for routine meetings, was full that night. Chairs pulled in from storage closets, residents standing along the back wall because there weren't enough seats. Homeowners who had once trusted her leadership without question now sat with their arms crossed, waiting for answers she didn't have. "Why weren't we told about this easement termination years ago?" one member asked. "Why has our maintenance fee included work on land the association never legally controlled?" asked another. A third resident, more pointed than the others, asked directly whether any dues would be refunded now that the association had confirmed it never had legal authority over the disputed section in the first place. Victoria had no satisfying response to offer any of them. The silence that followed her attempts to explain herself was louder than anything Ethan had said to her that morning on the gravel path. Richard, standing beside her at the front of the room, did what he could to steer the conversation toward procedure and process, toward committees and reviews and timelines, but even his practiced calm couldn't fully absorb the frustration in the room. Gregory Patton stood up near the back and asked, plainly, how many other residents had received notices over the years for violations that, like Ethan's, were based on the same flawed internal map. Nobody could answer him with certainty that night, and the admission that nobody could answer him seemed to unsettle the room more than any specific number would have. A woman near the front, someone who had served on the Architectural Review Committee for 6 years, said quietly that she had always assumed the association's records were accurate because nobody had ever told her otherwise, and that she felt embarrassed now for having enforced rules she never thought to question. Victoria attempted at one point to shift the conversation toward Ethan himself, suggesting that perhaps he should have raised the discrepancy through proper channels rather than allowing it to become a public spectacle on Larkspur Lane. The room did not receive this well. Brian Kowalski reminded her, in front of everyone, that Ethan had in fact sent written notice months earlier, the same notice bearing her own signature, and that it was Victoria who had escalated a documented, previously acknowledged disagreement into a police matter rather than simply reviewing the file she had already been given. Victoria had no response to that either. Richard, sensing the meeting was moving somewhere he couldn't control, moved to adjourn early, promising a full written report within 30 days. By the end of the meeting, the board had voted to commission an independent audit of every property line in the community and to establish a formal process for residents to challenge any notice issued based on the outdated internal map. A separate motion passed, narrowly, directing the treasurer to calculate how much of the community's collected dues over the previous several years had been allocated toward maintenance of land the association did not actually own, with a recommendation that a portion of future dues be adjusted accordingly. It was, everyone in the room understood, an admission, however carefully worded, that something had gone wrong for a very long time. A week later, Ethan stood near the fence he had rebuilt, running one hand along the new wood, still faintly smelling of sawdust and fresh stain. An association vehicle rolled slowly down Larkspur Lane, the same route it always took on its rounds through the neighborhood. This time, no one stepped out. There was no confrontation waiting to happen, no laminated notice pressed into his hand, no threat delivered in the practiced tone of someone certain of her own authority. The car simply continued past, and the street returned to its usual, unremarkable quiet. Margaret Simmons stopped by later that afternoon, carrying a plate of cookies she said were a thank you, though she never fully explained what exactly she was thanking him for. She mentioned, almost in passing, that she had finally pulled her own deed out of a drawer after 20 years, and confirmed that a section of her own backyard, one the association had quietly mowed every summer without ever asking, sat entirely within her own boundary lines as well. She wasn't angry about it, not exactly. She simply seemed relieved to finally understand something she had never thought to question. Over the following month, 3 other households in Cedar Hollow came forward with similar findings, each one prompted by the story of the fence and the file box that had somehow ended up settling far more than a single property dispute. Gregory Patton discovered that a strip of land behind his own garage, one he had been quietly paying a landscaping surcharge to maintain for nearly a decade, had never actually belonged to the association at all. The Kowalskis found a smaller discrepancy near their side yard, nothing as significant as Ethan's case, but enough to prompt a formal correction to their file. Richard Cole, to his credit, handled each new discovery with more diligence than he had shown on the morning of the original confrontation, cross-referencing every claim against the county's records before responding, unwilling to repeat the mistake of trusting an internal document that had never been properly verified. Victoria remained on the board through the end of her term, though her authority never fully recovered. She stopped issuing violation notices without first confirming boundaries against the county's recorded plats, a change several residents noted with quiet approval, even if none of them said so directly to her. She never apologized to Ethan in any formal sense, not in front of the board, not in writing. But several weeks after the confrontation, she left a note in his mailbox, unsigned, acknowledging that she had been wrong to escalate the matter the way she had, and that she should have reviewed his documentation before involving the police. Ethan read it once, folded it, and placed it in the same file box where everything else had been kept, not out of resentment, but simply because it seemed like the kind of thing worth keeping alongside everything else that had led to that Tuesday morning. Back inside, Ethan set the file box down on the kitchen table and opened it one final time that evening. The first page inside was the deed, the same document that had started everything, its ink slightly faded but its legal description as precise as the day it was recorded. The last page was the county's certified confirmation of the boundary lines, the document that had ultimately settled every question raised that morning. He closed the folder gently, the same way a person closes a book they know they'll return to again someday, and set it aside. He thought briefly about how easily the entire confrontation could have gone differently. If he had raised his voice that morning, if he had matched Victoria's certainty with anger of his own, the story might have ended with 2 neighbors shouting at each other on a gravel path while an officer tried to restore order. Instead, he had simply reached for a box of paper, the same instinct that had guided his entire career, trusting the record over the argument, trusting the document over the tone of voice behind it. It was, he thought, the only kind of victory worth having, the kind that didn't require anyone to lose their dignity in order for the truth to come out. He hadn't won because he shouted louder than Victoria Hayes. He hadn't won through intimidation or through some clever manipulation of the moment. He had won because when she picked up her phone and called the police, convinced that a badge and a uniform would settle the matter in her favor, she had unknowingly invited the entire truth into the open, laid out across the hood of a patrol car for everyone on that street to see, including the very paperwork she had hoped no one would ever bother to read. There was a kind of quiet justice in that, one that didn't need to announce itself. Ethan had never wanted a confrontation. He had never wanted his name attached to a dispute that ended up reshaping an entire community's understanding of its own boundaries. He had simply wanted to finish repairing a fence on a Tuesday morning, and when that ordinary task was interrupted by someone convinced her authority outweighed his ownership, he had reached for the only tool he trusted completely, a box of documents that had sat quietly in his closet for 4 years, waiting for a moment nobody had expected to arrive. Months later, when new residents moved into Cedar Hollow and asked around about the community's history, someone would inevitably mention the story of the fence, the file box, and the morning an HOA president called the police only to watch her own authority dissolve under the weight of a deed she had never bothered to read carefully. It became, in its own understated way, the kind of story neighborhoods tell themselves for years afterward, not because it involved shouting or spectacle, but because it proved something quieter and more enduring, that the truth, once properly documented and calmly presented, rarely needs to raise its voice to be heard.